This is a reading from Daulaire's Book of Greek Mythology. Minor gods, nymphs, satyrs, and centaurs. Minor gods and goddesses also lived on Olympus besides the 12 great ones. The most powerful of them were the goddesses of destiny, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. They were the three fates, and they decided how long a mortal would live and how long the rule of the gods should last. When a mortal was born, Clotho spun the thread of life, Lachesis measured a certain length, and Atropos cut the thread at the end of the life. They knew the past and the future, and even Zeus had no power to sway their decisions. Their sister, Nemesis, saw to it that all evil and all good on earth were justly repaid, and all mortals feared her. Man's creator and his best friend was the Titan Prometheus. Zeus had given Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus the task of repopulating the earth after all living creatures had perished in the early battles of the gods. He gave the two brothers great measures of gifts to bestow upon their creations, and they went down to earth and began to make men and beasts out of river clay. Wise Prometheus modeled men with great care in the shape of the gods. Epimetheus rapidly made all kinds of animals, and without any foresight he lavished the good gifts upon them. When Prometheus had finished shaping man, he found that there were few of the good gifts left. Animals could run faster, see, smell, and hear better, and had much more endurance. Besides, they were kept snug in their warm coats of fur, while men shivered in the cold nights. Prometheus was sorry for mankind, and he went to Zeus and asked him if he might have some of the sacred fire for his poor creations. But Zeus said no, fire belonged to the gods alone. Prometheus could not bear to see his people suffer, and he decided to steal fire, though he knew that Zeus would punish him severely. He went up to Olympus, took a glowing ember from the sacred hearth, and hid it in a hollow stalk of fennel. He carried it down to earth, gave it to mankind, and told them never to let the light from Olympus die out. No longer did men shiver in the cold of the night, and the beasts feared the light of the fire, and did not dare to attack them. A strange thing happened. As men lifted their eyes from the ground, and watched the smoke from their fires spiraling upward, their thoughts rose with it up to the heavens. They began to wonder and think, and were no longer earthbound clods. They built temples to honor the gods, and, wanting to share what they had with them, they burned the best pieces of meat on their altars. Zeus was furious when he first saw the fires flickering on earth, but he was appeased when the savory scent of roast meat reached his nostrils. All the gods loved the smell of the burnt offerings. It spiced their daily food of ambrosia and nectar. But Prometheus knew how hard men worked to make their living, and thought it a pity that they burned up the best parts of their food. He told them to butcher an ox, and divide the meat in 2 equal heaps. In one were the chops and roasts, hidden under sinews and bones. In the other were scraps and entrails, covered with snow-white fat. Prometheus then invited Zeus to come down to earth, and choose for himself which part he wanted for his burnt offerings. Zeus, of course, chose the best-looking heap, but when he discovered that he had been tricked, he grew very angry. Not only had Prometheus stolen the fire and given it to men, he had also taught them to cheat the gods. He resolved to punish both Prometheus and his creations. Cast in unbreakable irons, Prometheus was chained to the top of the Caucasus Mountains. Every day an eagle swooped out of the sky and ate his liver. At night his immortal liver grew anew, but every day the eagle returned and he had to suffer again. Thus was Prometheus punished. But Zeus found a more subtle way to punish the mortals. He sent to earth a beautiful but silly woman. Her name was Pandora. Pandora was modeled by Hephaestus in the likeness of Aphrodite. He carved her out of a block of white marble, made her lips of red rubies, and her eyes of sparkling sapphires. Athena breathed life into her and dressed her in elegant garments. Aphrodite decked her with jewels and fixed her red mouth in a winning smile. Into the mind of this beautiful creature Zeus put insatiable curiosity, and then he gave her a sealed jar and warned her never to open it. Hermes brought Pandora down to earth and offered her in marriage to Prometheus, who lived among the mortals. Prometheus had been warned by Prometheus never to accept a gift from Zeus, but he could not resist the beautiful woman. Thus Pandora came to live among mortals, and men came from near and far to stand awestruck by her wondrous beauty. But Pandora was not perfectly happy, for she did not know what was in the jar that Zeus had given her. It was not long before her curiosity got the better of her, and she had to take a quick peek. The moment she opened the lid, out swarmed a horde of miseries, greed, vanity, slander, envy, and all the evils that until then had been unknown to mankind. Horrified at what she had done, Pandora clapped the lid on, just in time to keep Hope from flying away too. Zeus had put Hope at the bottom of the jar, and the unleashed miseries would quickly have put an end to it. They stung and bit the mortals as Zeus had planned, but their sufferings made them wicked instead of good, as Zeus had hoped. They lied, they stole, and they killed each other, and became so evil that Zeus in disgust decided to drown them in a flood. But there was one man on earth who had not turned evil. He was a son of Prometheus. His name was Deucalion. Deucalion often went to the Caucasus Mountains to comfort his suffering father. He could not break the chains that bound him, but while he was there he could keep away the eagle that tortured Prometheus. Deucalion was a good son, and his father was thankful for his help. Prometheus, who could look into the future, knew that Zeus was planning to flood the earth. He told his son to build an ark, and board it with Pyrrha, his virtuous wife. Deucalion did as his father told him. He built a sturdy ark, and when Zeus let loose all the winds and opened wide the floodgates of the sky, he went aboard with Pyrrha. For 9 days and 9 nights it rained until the whole earth was flooded. Nothing but the highest mountain peaks remained above water, and all mortals were drowned. Only Deucalion and Pyrrha were saved. They floated in their ark over the deep dark waters. On the 10th day the rain stopped, and slowly dry land began to appear. Deucalion and Pyrrha stepped out of the ark and walked about on the desolate earth. Lonesome and forlorn, they came to a temple grown over with seaweed, and entered it. The sacred fire on the altar had gone out, but they lit it again with the embers they had kept glowing aboard the ark, and lifted up their hands in prayer to the gods, to thank them for saving their lives. Zeus was touched by their piety, and felt sorry for them because they were so lonesome. He spoke to them and said, "Pick up the bones of your mother and throw them over your shoulders." Deucalion understood that Zeus did not mean their mortal mothers, but their mother Earth. Rocks were her bones. He told Pyrrha to pick up a handful of stones and throw them over her shoulder, while he did the same. Behind Deucalion a score of men sprang up, and there, behind Pyrrha, a score of women. This new race of mortals was called Deucalion's race. The Deucalion race, made from stone, was hardier than the one made from clay. The new mortals withstood better the stings of Pandora's miseries, which of course had flown high and dry during the flood, and plague mankind to this very day. The winds had carried on as they wished from when Zeus flooded the earth. They were powerful fellows, and when they stormed together they brought confusion and destruction, whirling dust and water all the way up to Olympus. Zeus decided that they needed a dependable guardian who would keep them locked up and let out only one at a time. He chose Aulus, a grandson of Deucalion and Pyrrha, to be the keeper of the winds, and sent him to live with them and guard them in a hollow cliff far out at sea. The winds hated to be confined. They stormed and howled around Aulus, trying to force their way out of the cavern, but Aulus was steady and strong and kept them in hand. When Poseidon or one of the gods called for a wind, Aulus pierced the wall of the cliff with his spear and let the wind out. Then he plugged up the hole and kept it closed until it was time for the wind to return. When Boreas, the north wind, was called for, he rushed out, icy and wild, tearing up trees and piling up waves in front of him. When Notus, the south wind, was let out, he pressed himself groaning through the hole in the cliff. He was so heavy with moisture that water dripped from his tangled beard, and he spread a leaden fog over land and sea. Wanderers lost their paths, and ships drifted helplessly about. Zephyr, the west wind, was gentler than his brothers. When he blew, he swept the sky clear of clouds, and all nature smiled. Eurus, the east wind, was the least important of the brothers. He wasn't called for often. Eos, gentle dawn, was the mother of the four winds. While all creation slept, she rose from her pink pillows to announce the coming of a new day. She dipped her rosy fingers into a cup filled with dew, and sprinkled the drops over flowers and trees. All nature awoke, rejoicing to see her. One morning, as Eos looked down on earth, her eyes fell on a young prince waking from his slumber. He was so handsome she could not take her eyes off him, and she wanted him for her husband. But how could she, who was a goddess, be married to a mortal whose lifespan was so short? As soon as her morning duties were done, she went to Zeus and persuaded him to grant eternal life to the young prince, whose name was Tithonus. She brought him with her to her palace in the east, and they spent many delightful years together. But Eos had forgotten to ask that Tithonus be also given eternal youth, and slowly his strength left his once supple limbs. He shriveled and shrank, and his manly voice changed to a feeble squeak. He shrank to a tiny, wizened old man. Yet he could not die, for he had been given eternal life. He became so small and weak that Eos had to put him into a little basket and hide him in a corner of her palace. There, in his dark corner, he went on withering and shriveling, till at last he turned into a grasshopper, chirping for all eternity. But Eos stayed rosy and young, always a joy to behold when she came out to wake the sleeping world and announce the coming of her brother the sun. Helios the sun mounted his glowing chariot and drove out in great splendor as soon as Eos threw open the gates of his golden palace in the east. His radiance lit up the wide expanse of sky. So bright was he that only the gods could look straight at him without being blinded. Brilliant rays encircled his head, and his chariot glowed like fire. With a strong hand Helios guided his 4 fiery steeds up the vault of the heavens. The path was steep and narrow, and the horses were wild, but Helios held them well on their course. At high noon he stopped at the top of the sky and looked around, and nothing could escape his piercing gaze. Again he drove on, and now he gave free rein to his steeds. Far to the west they could see his glittering evening palace, and eager to reach their stables, they raced on the downhill course, faster and faster. They passed a great herd of white cows, hurrying homeward to Helios's palace, and met a large flock of sheep going out to pasture in the sky. For Helios owned a snow-white cow for each day of the year, and a woolly sheep for each night. The shadows grew long, and dusk settled over the world when Helios and his foaming team arrived. His 5 daughters, the Heliades, awaited them. They unharnessed the tired horses and let them plunge into the ocean for a cooling bath. Then the horses rested in their stables, and Helios talked with his daughters and told them all he had seen that day. In the dark of the night he boarded a vessel of gold with his team and sailed around the world, back to his palace in the east. The way was far shorter by sea than by air, so he had time to stay for a while in his morning palace, too, before he set out on another day's journey. Helios had a son named Phaethon. He was a mortal, and very proud of his radiant father. One morning, as Helios was about to set off on his daily journey across the sky, Phaethon came to him and begged him to grant his dearest wish. Helios, who was very fond of his handsome son, rashly swore by the river Styx to give him any wish he might have. But when he heard Phaethon's wish, he sorely regretted his oath. He tried in vain to make his son change his mind, for what Phaethon wanted was to drive the sun chariot for one day, and Helios knew that no one but he himself could handle the spirited steeds. Phaethon was determined to have his wish, and Helios had to give in. Sadly, he put his golden rays on his son's head, and rubbed divine ointment on his skin so he could withstand the searing heat of the chariot. He barely had time to warn him to stay well in the middle of the heavenly path, when the gates of the palace were thrown open, and the rearing horses were brought forth. Phaethon leapt out into the chariot, grasped the reins, and the horses rushed out. At first all went well, and Phaethon stood proudly in the glowing chariot, but the fiery steeds soon felt that unskilled hands were holding the reins. They veered off the heavenly path, and brushed by the dangerous constellations that lurked on both sides of it. The animals of the zodiac were enraged. The bull charged, the lion growled, the scorpion lashed out with its poisonous tail. The horses shied, and Phaethon was thrown halfway out of the chariot. Far down below he saw the earth, and he grew so dizzy that he dropped the reins. Without a firm hand to guide them, the horses bolted. They raced so close to the earth that the ground cracked from the heat of the chariot, and rivers and lakes dried up. Then upward they sped so high that the earth froze and turned to ice. Zeus stood on Olympus and shook his head. He had to stop the Cairenian chariot to save the earth from destruction, and he threw a thunderbolt at it. In a shower of sparks, the chariot flew apart, and Phaethon plunged into the river Po. On the river banks his sisters mourned so long that Zeus took pity on them, and changed them into poplar trees, and their tears into drops of golden amber. Hephaestus had to work the whole night through to mend the broken chariot so Helios could drive it again the next day. Helios grieved over his lost son, and he never again allowed anyone to drive his chariot except for Apollo, the god of light. Next we will continue with Selene, the moon. Hope you enjoyed this reading from Daulaire's Book of Greek Mythology. Purchase your own copy on Amazon.